Before talking about the details of the topic, let me mention quickly my collaborators, which have also contributed to the work that I'm going to present. In particular, Guillaume Mancio, Ben Chayefsky, and Jehan Cho, but also Till Junge, Phil Mosley, Fabio Pavia, Jean-François Molinari, and my PhD advisor, Bill Curtin. So the topic itself is very algorithmic. It's about development and analysis of algorithms. However, in the context of this conference here, I will approach this topic from a more practical material scientist point of view. So what I'm going to do is first to try to convince you why we need atomistic models in general. Then the remaining parts will follow from this motivation, namely the introduction of an atomistic to continuum coupling method and the construction of atomistic continuum coupling, efficient atomistic continuum coupling methods using green function techniques. To start globally, in material science, our objective is to study and in most cases optimize materials in order to build structures, like industrial applications, for example, car industries, aeronautic industries, or also energy industries, nuclear fusion reactors, for example. If you want to design metals for these applications, in the end, you always end up with studying the motion and reaction of dislocations, which characterize plastic deformations of metals on a very fundamental level. Dislocations are line defects in a crystalline medium, shown here on the upper left side of the screen. And they are line defects because they break the symmetry of an atomic lattice along this line here. And what's actually interesting in the context of dislocations is not the dislocation line itself, but it's the interaction of dislocations with other defects, interactions with other dislocations or grain boundaries, cracks, etc. So we are actually interested in analyzing dislocation networks in order to characterize the deformation of a material. There are a lot of modeling techniques to do these kind of problems, ranging from continuum down to the atomistic scale. And if you want to follow, for instance, a hierarchical approach to model a macroscopic behavior of a material, you can, for example, do the following. You can start with quantum mechanics. You can compute bulk material properties of your problem. You can compute elastic constants, etc. And with these quantities, you can fit your atomistic potential. With an atomistic potential, you can do a bit more. You can characterize your deformation on the dislocation level. You can compute long dislocations. You can compute dislocation loops. Essentially, you can compute energy barriers and core energies of these dislocations with which you can feed higher scale models, for example, discrete dislocation dynamics. And with discrete dislocation dynamics, you can do even more. You can compute very large dislocation networks. In microspecimens, you can then load these samples, and you can actually compute effective properties in order to compute strain curves, etc., with which you can then, in the end, calibrate your macroscopic crystal plasticity or phenomenological plasticity law. However, there are also situations where the hierarchical approach does not work, and that's the case which is related to the actual topic of this talk. And this is relevant to this talk, the interaction between atomistic and discrete dislocation scales. In what cases can you not decouple these scales? Well, you cannot decouple them if a phenomenon on a larger scale influences the quantity that you want to compute on the smaller scale. I'll give you an example for that. This is a very large atomistic simulation of a crack problem published in a recent paper by Bitzek and Gumsch. So they wanted to analyze the influence of an existing microstructure, so that means a dislocation network, on the behavior of the crack tip. So that means you need already this large discrete dislocation network in order to identify, to compute, to predict the variable with the atomistic model that you're interested in. So that's a classical example where you cannot hierarchically couple the problems, and a straightforward approach to solve this problem is, well, you just do a very large atomistic simulation in order to capture all these phenomena. However, this is extremely expensive, and you may only do that if you're extremely rich and can do simulations of like 40 to 50 million atoms. And even if you're very rich, these simulations may not be very accurate because you have to use very cheap potentials, which may not predict the precise atomistic mechanism. So what you actually want to do, you just want to represent the atomistic part in this small region around the crack tip and model the remainder of your domain with a cheaper model. For example, discrete dislocations. I give you an example what happens if you're not so rich and you cannot do 40 million atoms. Then you have a situation like this. So this is a void problem where you have this void here in the center of a spherical atomistic domain, and you load your specimen in the y direction, and at some point the void will spit out defects, dislocations, for instance. And now you can compare clamp boundary conditions with a coupled approach. So here you couple the atomistic region with elasticity boundary conditions using a boundary element method. And what you see here, you see a completely different microstructure. So if you don't take into account a large atomistic simulation, then you eventually get completely wrong results. So what we actually want to do is something like this. We want to couple our atomistic problem to some cheaper model with which we can capture the actual effects in our atomistic region. There are essentially two flavors with which you can do these kind of problems. One thing you can do is to model this with the quasi-continuum method. If you consider this problem here, this indentation problem, where you apply an indenter to an atomistic region, you can start by modeling this part under the indenter fully atomistically and model the remainder of your domain with a linearized model. The problem with the quasi-continuum approach is that if you have dislocations which are propagating in the remainder of your domain, you end up eventually with this kind of situation. Namely, you have to remesh, or sort of remesh your atomistic region, because you have to keep track of the dislocations. So eventually, if dislocations are present in the entire domain, you end up with essentially a fully atomistic problem, and in the end, you may not gain so much. So another approach is a more goal-oriented approach, which is shown on the right side. You can just keep the initial atomistic domain fixed, and you can couple that region with a discrete dislocation mechanics model. So what that means is when your atomistic dislocation comes to the interface, it just becomes a discrete dislocation. Very simple to understand, I think, and it's also very straightforward to conclude that if you do such an approach, you get a reduction in the number of degrees of freedom of several order of magnitude. There's also an example for this in my thesis, in case you're interested in. So very simple idea and a very strong outcome. So what you have to do is you can define a force balance in your atomistic domain, and you can define a force balance in your continuum domain. But then, in addition, in the discrete dislocation model, you also have a force balance on your dislocation line. And this implies that you also have an additional state variable in your discrete dislocation model, which actually does not exist in your atomistic model. Because in the atomistic model, there is no notion of a dislocation as a discrete line representation. The solution to this problem is, well, let's just identify a line representation of our atomistic dislocation, and in fact, we can do something like that. Alexander Stukovsky is the main guy in this field. He published several approaches to this problem in order to identify a discrete line representation in the atomistic domain. And now we can set up a boundary condition for our state variable in the continuum problem. So we just say, okay, our continuum dislocation line has to match the atomistic dislocation line at the artificial interface. So how can we evolve that problem? Well, we just split the problem into two parts. So one is the atomistic part, and one is the continuum part. So we start by defining an initial dislocation network. We apply as an initial guess the elastic solution coming from the Green's function of the dislocation network, and we apply this boundary condition on the atomistic domain. We solve the atomistic domain, the dislocation line will evolve, and we pass the detected dislocation line to the continuum problem. In the continuum problem, what we do is we take this dislocation line and we connect it to our continuum dislocation line. To complete the dislocation network, we again compute the Green function of our entire dislocation network, and we evolve the dislocation in the continuum domain. And then we iterate between the two problems until we converge. So this method here is a specific scheme that is valid if you have only dislocations in your problem, and it's very efficient because it doesn't require a numerical solution of your continuum problem. Everything here is analytic. We just use the Green's function of our dislocation network. So let's check if it works. For this purpose, we consider a test problem which looks like this. So we have a dislocation in a periodic domain. So what you do here, essentially, you take a straight dislocation, you fix it at pinning points on the sides, and under some shear stress, the dislocation will bow out. And you can do that fully atomistically, and you can do that with a discrete dislocation model. And these two models are our two reference models. So let's check if the two agree. So we have checked this by computing the dislocation bow out for several applied shear stresses, and we see that even some higher shear stresses, we get some good agreement between the shapes of the dislocation. So here there's some slight deviation, but that's still taking into account that the dislocation model that we use is not the most sophisticated one. This is very, very good agreement. So that's a good start for the coupled problem. Now what we see here is we have split the problem into two parts. Like the left one is the atomistic part, and the right one is the discrete dislocation part. What we see here is essentially the algorithm that I was showing a few slides before. So you iterate between the two problems until you eventually converge. And to just comment on the final solution, what we have here is the two reference solutions which deviate slightly. And what you expect from the coupled problem is that it lies like in between the two reference solutions, because the problem is symmetric, and exactly that's what we observe here. Another problem that we have computed is this one here. We have taken 1/4 of the entire domain as fully atomistic and the remainder as a continuum problem. And here we also get very reasonable results in our final solution. So the two reference problems agree in the atomistic domain. So our coupled simulation is in agreement with the reference solution and in agreement with the discrete dislocation solution in the remainder of the domain. So in the continuum part. So for this test case, our method works fine. And I will conclude with a few comments on where we are currently. This is a simulation video that I extracted from Jehan's recent paper. This is showing a Frank Reed source, the dislocation blowout from the Frank Reed source. So we have applied this algorithm to this problem, and Jehan has also developed some passing scheme in order to transfer this dislocation from the atomistic domain into the discrete dislocation domain. Yeah, so this is something what we can do currently. However, there are still a lot of open questions, and I think defining all these open questions would probably take additional 5 slides. So I will just end my talk by saying, okay, we still have a lot of work to do regarding implementation, solvers, analysis, accuracy, etc. So there's something for everyone: mathematics, material science, engineering problems, and yeah. So based on our encouraging previous results, I think this will still continue in the near future. Thank you very much.